So, today on the podcast, the State of the Disney Company 2025. It's been a while since we've done an episode like this where we looked around the company as a whole and discussed what was working overall, what needed to be fixed, and also identified true drags on the company's profitability, and also what these elements together indicate for the future of the company. And this week with the recent earnings call seems like a good time to do that. A little over a week ago, Disney posted its first earnings report and conducted its first earnings call for 2025, which covered the final 3 months of 2024, which on the Disney calendar is Q1. Overall, it was a mixed bag for the company. The two relative bright spots on the first quarter earnings report were theatrical films and Disney+. Again, it was a mixed bag. Nothing in the report significantly elevated the stock price, and likewise, nothing sent it tumbling. For many months now, the Disney stock price has hovered in a relatively narrow channel. For example, as I record this on Friday, February 14th, Disney stock opened at $109 per share. 1 month ago, it was $108 per share. It has moved a little up and down around these numbers from 106 to 113, but no significant shifts that would show a meaningfully increased or decreased investor confidence. In fact, after the earnings report, Disney stock actually dipped a little, meaning that investors weren't particularly impressed or enthused with what they saw. And in this, I think I see a company that is doing relatively well, but also one that is stuck at a certain valuation because it can't meaningfully leverage its properties towards higher earnings in multiple divisions. And I don't mean to sound negative about the steady level of the Disney price. Investors are often looking quarter to quarter, but if you pull back just a little, you see a more complex picture. In the last 5 years, Disney has gone through a pandemic, has seen a massive transformation in the number of people buying movie tickets, has been at the center of a culture war, went through a fight with the state of Florida, endured 2 years of a deeply flawed CEO, watched a year of very high inflation move consumers away from discretionary spending, went through multiple rounds of layoffs, and saw not one but 2 hostile takeover attempts of its board by outside investors who wanted to radically change the company. So after all this, really, stability is not a bad place to land, with Disney beating Wall Street profit estimates by 31 cents. But also investors and fans want more. We will have 3 segments to look at the state of the company today. The first will focus on theatrical releases, and the big question here is this. Will Disney, with a larger slate of high-budget films this next year, be able to recreate the pre-pandemic numbers at the box office? In 2025, Disney essentially is putting forward a large and costly experiment to test this theory. And if this doesn't work, then the next question is, where in the Disney ecosystem can the company find additional profit from film or film-related projects? The second segment will focus on streaming, and specifically, how can Disney reconfigure its streamers toward consistent and meaningful profitability while also satisfying fans? And the last segment is focused on the parks and other experiences, which are truly a mixed bag, which we'll get into later. The cruise line is a growing and profitable division in the company's portfolio, with multiple new ships being built to join those that are already on the water. But the American parks, and I mean Florida in particular, are a different story. So we've got a lot of ground to cover today, and a lot of complex topics to tackle as we try to understand the health of the Disney company as a whole after the first earnings report and earnings call of 2025. So if you've got all that, let's just kick into our episode and talk about where the company is right now and also where it's heading. So, our first segment is focused on Disney's theatrical releases. And before I jump into the Disney theatrical offerings, I want to put this whole segment in context. The current fanfare story within the industry is that the domestic box office is up substantially in 2023 and 2024, which is true if you look at 2022 and even 2021. For both of these recent years, that's 2023 and 24, the domestic box office ended at just under $9 billion, $8.9 billion in 2023 and $8.5 in 2024. Even though this is better than 2022, this is still significantly below the last pre-pandemic year, where the box office ended at $11.5 billion. In other words, the box office for the year that just ended, 2024, is only 73% of 2029. That's a 27% drop-off in revenue, but actual attendance is a little more nuanced than this, as these numbers don't account for inflation. During the same period, the average price of a movie ticket rose by 18%. Once you factor in for inflation, you find a 33% drop in attendance at domestic movies. That is, a third fewer tickets were sold in 2024 than in 2019, and 2024 was a good post-pandemic year for domestic offerings. So simply, the changes that we talked about as likely happening during the pandemic are now starting to solidify into a new level of normalcy. American movie theaters have emerged from the pandemic with 67% of the audience base that they had before COVID, as moviegoers, though still going to the movies, are going far less and are often opting to stay home and watch streamers or linear TV, when pre-COVID these same people would have gone out to the movies. To put it simply, there's now 33% fewer seats filled in American theaters. The other noticeable overall change is an even larger dominance of sequels, franchise, and cinematic universe films post-pandemic. This trend was already happening pre-pandemic, but is becoming more pronounced now. In 2024, for the domestic box office, no non-sequel or non-franchise film was able to gross more than $150 million at the box office. That is, the box office now more heavily relies on familiar properties, shifting away from original works. Inside of Disney, original scripts not tied to familiar properties or familiar characters have been more likely to premiere on the Disney Plus streamer than in theaters. In this reduced marketplace, Disney had a good year with theatrical releases. Disney brought in $2.2 billion from the domestic box office. That is, 26% of all the money that was made at the domestic box office came from a Disney offering, with Disney largely buoyed by Inside Out 2 and Deadpool 3, which were the top two films of the year. Disney was also the top studio. Second on the list at $1.88 billion, or 22% of the box office, was Universal. Universal as well had a good year, largely buoyed by Wicked and Despicable Me 4, the third and fifth top earners at the box office. Disney's best period in 2024 was summer, and a little less so at the end of the year, which is the period that the Q1 earnings report covers. The high point for Disney theatrical in Q1 was Moana 2. And to be honest, I'm a little surprised how well this film did. Personally, I enjoyed Moana 2, but I never felt it was as transformative or as musical as the first film. For me, it felt very much like a TV effort that had been slightly reshaped for the big screen, which is exactly what it was. It was a bit episodic, and though the narrative transitions were smoothed over in the film version, I'm pretty sure I could point out where one episode of the original Disney Plus miniseries was supposed to end and the next begin. It also felt like a story with lower stakes, a story that was less consequential for its main character, that was supposed to tide the audience over with it being shown on Disney Plus until a narrative of more substance arrived on the big screen, and maybe that was supposed to be the live-action remake of Moana. Despite these shortcomings, though, Bob Iger's gamble to shift it to theatrical and increase its budget played off in spades, as Moana 2 was one of the anchors that solidified Disney's strong showing at the box office this past year. It came in fourth for 2024, just behind Wicked. In shifting this film, Iger looks prescient, as though he had a good idea of what type of film property would play well in theaters over the winter break. And this here will also set up some of our discussion later in the segment about theatrical releases. The other Q1 film to which Disney had pinned its hopes was Mufasa. This film underperformed in its early days of release. It's presently at $672 million worldwide, with 65% of that money coming from international markets, mostly from Europe. Disney gets a smaller take of international ticket sales, and so with much of the box office skewed toward overseas revenue, I believe that this film, which cost about $200 million to produce, plus promotional costs, probably needs to cross the $700 million mark to be safely placed in the profitable category. It surely will cross this mark and just based on theatrical revenue be deemed profitable. But this is far from the $1.6 billion that the live-action Lion King remake made back in 2019. Without adjusting for inflation, this is a 60% fall-off in tickets purchased for a Lion King offering. And with adjusting for inflation, it means that 65% fewer people saw Mufasa in a theater than saw the 2019 version of The Lion King. And 65% is larger than the overall 33% decline in American film attendance in general in the last few years. Last summer, before Mufasa came out, Disney announced that Disney Adventure World, which is that revamped park in Paris, would receive a log flume ride based on the live-action Lion King franchise. I'm pretty sure that Paris log flume ride is still moving forward, but I'm also guessing that there's going to be a lot of serious discussions and some head-scratching focused on if the Lion King is still the best property to theme that ride. Looking forward through 2025, Disney is substantially increasing its theatrical output, essentially shifting focus away from the Disney Plus streamer and placing it again on theaters. Gone are the days where company executives are discussing content on Disney Plus as similar to the type of projects that are released initially to theaters. The experiment here for 2025 seems really clear. Disney wants to see if a larger number of franchise sequels and cinematic universe films will sell more tickets overall. In 2024, Disney released just 4 of these films. In 2025, it will release 10. My general sense is that viewing habits have now changed and that it's more likely Disney will further divide the existing number of tickets sold over more films, with maybe a little uptick in overall box office, but probably not enough to justify a slate of high-profile films, which is 250% times larger than that of the previous year. It will be interesting to see how all of this plays out. As I mentioned, Disney has 10 films from its core studios, and by that I mean Disney, Lucasfilm, Marvel, and Pixar, that it hopes will do large business. For the record, I'm leaving Fox out of the mix with films like The First Omen, as at least for me, they don't strongly connect to the core Disney identity. If anything, I suspect Disney's strategy will work better in summer and late winter, particularly with young and young adult viewers, than it will over the whole year. But the main elements to hold on here are that in 2025, Disney is testing the waters to see how well a pre-pandemic slate of big-budget films will fare in a post-pandemic theatrical landscape. I'll walk through all of these films in order of release date. First up is Captain America: Brave New World. I was a fan of the Captain American miniseries on Disney Plus a few years back, but this film is already receiving a lot of mixed reviews, which suggests that this probably isn't going to be the film that will pull Marvel up out of its multi-year slump. I do think that Marvel will likely come up out of this slump later this year, but just not with this particular film. Second, the live-action remake of Snow White. This is an extremely expensive film. Variety estimates that its budget is around $240 million. This is a film that has been paused, restarted, reshot, reconsidered, and delayed. I do understand why Disney wants to make it, which in part pertains to copyright law. Steamboat Willie is now public domain, as is the Silly Symphony short The Skeleton Dance. The 1937 animated version of Snow White will enter the public domain in 2032, which is 7 years away. A live-action version of this property gives Disney new character designs that it can control through copyright for decades, even as the more familiar hand-animated versions of Doc, Grumpy, and Dopey fall into the public domain. The inside buzz on this movie is that it's not fabulous. The sections that I've seen lack the cuteness and appeal of the original film. The 2023 live-action remake of The Little Mermaid ended up with $569 million. The live-action version of Snow White will need to take in significantly more than this to turn a profit, and I see that as a difficult goal to reach. The third film is Thunderbolts. This is a film that will focus on minor anti-hero characters in the MCU that we've previously, if briefly, met. Red Guardian, Yelena Belova, the Taskmaster, Ava Starr, and so on. The one well-known character in this post-Avengers team-up is Bucky Barnes, aka the Winter Soldier. The big advantage here is that Marvel isn't limited to the demands of an ongoing narrative or a set of well-established characters. Or let me put it this way. In recent years, the highest-earning films are those in which the studio delivers a strong story with well-known characters, but beneath that, there is a set of films that presents lesser-known characters with original stories. And below that are Marvel films, such as The Marvels, that use familiar characters, but are hampered by narrative restraints or a less-than-stellar story. That is, with a little bit of luck here, Marvel, with the freedom to build this story mostly from scratch, ends up with something akin to Guardians of the Galaxy to launch this project into the very respectable mid-range of Marvel efforts with an eye toward later films if this goes well. I will say this, I've seen the trailer and I have no clue who the villain is. I will also say that Disney is very optimistic about this project. Fourth on the list is a live-action remake of Lilo and Stitch. And from multiple conversations, I know that Disney is optimistic about this project as well. You can even see this in how the company is spending money. For the Super Bowl, where a 30-second spot cost about $8 million, Snow White was nowhere to be seen. An ad for the new Captain America was left out of that mix as well. But there were lengthy ads for Thunderbolts and Lilo and Stitch, which shows you, by levels of spending, where Disney thinks the films are that will most benefit from robust and expensive ad campaigns. To pay for an $8 million 30-second spot or a $16 million minute-long spot, you got to be pretty convinced that such a spot will significantly increase ticket sales for a well-reviewed film. After Lilo, I think we move into mixed territory again. Fifth is Pixar's Elio, which, as we've noted before, has substantial rewrites, even to the point of removing central characters and central family relationships. Substantial revisions like this while a film is in production usually aren't a great sign, but we will see. Then Fantastic Four. If I had to pick one Marvel film that had the possibility of elevating Marvel in 2025, it would be this one here. Strong cast, interesting art design. In the comics community, the Fantastic Four are a well-known property which has never translated well previously to film. This film will be set in the 1960s in an alternate version of the MCU universe, which will give the script a lot of leeway in terms of how it presents the characters without being too strongly tied to other existing MCU elements. All of these, I think, are good signs. Then Freakier Friday, which has a modest production budget and also enjoys an existing fan base. It's been 22 years since the last Freaky Friday film with Jamie Lee Curtis and Lindsay Lohan. A mid-budget sequel here will probably do just fine. It will hit the nostalgia button, and it will allow young parents to take their own kids to see a sequel to a movie that they themselves remember fondly from their own childhoods. And then comes Tron 3. With multiple Tomorrowlands in various Disney parks, I understand why Disney wants to arrange a straight, near-future science fiction film franchise with a focus on tech. I was a fan of the first film, less so the second. Both of these films, at least at the box office, underperformed. So here's hoping this film fares better. 3 might just be the charm, but also I see this as an uphill battle, probably for a smaller audience that already enjoys the first 2 films. And then Disney ends up the year with relatively safe tentpole offerings, Zootopia 2 and Avatar 3. Both of those films should be fine. Again, I think what's likely to happen here is that the larger number of films will further divide the existing number of tickets sold. Maybe that pool grows a little bit, but I don't think it grows 250%, which is the increase in number of pictures released. But I see this as an interesting test that will help define what really is the limits of the post-pandemic theatrical landscape. Overall, for theatrical, this was a good quarter for Disney. Even with a less than stellar performance by Mufasa, the studio division presented a profit of $312 million, largely driven by Moana 2, which is a significant improvement over a $250 million loss a year ago. That loss for the last 3 months of 2023 was created mostly by the Marvels and by the animated film Wish. The improvement here is substantial, but this is still a far cry from the same quarter 5 years ago, the last quarter before the pandemic, where the studio division posted a $948 million profit, and that number isn't even adjusted upward for inflation. And here is one of the reasons that Disney is trading lower in recent years. Even though theatrical has overall returned to profitability, the question remains the same. Is there any possibility of moving theatrical profits for Disney closer to where they were pre-pandemic? From my vantage point, I think that world is mostly gone now, tilled under by 5 years of rapid social change, but maybe there's a way to find a landing point somewhere above the $312 million for the most recent quarter and the $948 million from the same quarter 5 years ago. That generally is the question with which Disney Theatrical is struggling. How much more upward growth is there in the current cinematic landscape? Our second segment is on streaming. Streaming was another bright spot for Disney. After the across-the-board monthly rate increases in October, Disney, as well as company watchers, expected the streamer to lose millions of subscribers. The price went up for both ad-supported and ad-free Disney Plus plans by $2. Disney lost less than 1 million subscribers. Specifically, it lost 700,000, ending with 125 million subscribers. And the benchmark comparison here is Netflix with over 300 million subscribers now. But the Disney streamer remained profitable for the quarter. The underlying reason for the profit, despite the lower subs here, are a little complicated. Even though the streamer lost 700,000 core subscribers, many of those losses were in countries where Disney Plus has a lower monthly rate than in the US or Europe. The US, with higher subscription rates, actually saw a slight increase in overall subscribers, and I suspect that the number of people who canceled Disney Plus would have been larger except for one thing, and that thing is Bluey. Disney Plus has the most streamed series in 2024. According to Nielsen, Bluey streamed just over 55 billion viewing minutes last year. If you have young kids, you are likely loath to cancel the streamer that offers Bluey. Until recently, Disney Plus was the only place to find Bluey, but I will point out that Bluey has its own YouTube channel with some full episodes, and back in November, the first 3 seasons of Bluey were released on Blu-ray for $40, so parents now have some options here. Regardless, Bluey is one of the anchors that keeps families subscribed. Beyond that, for the second year in a row, Moana was the top streamed movie with just over 13 billion viewing minutes. The short version of the story here is that attractive programming for younger viewers, such as Bluey and Moana, kept many households subscribed to Disney Plus. Disney's streaming division, which also includes Hulu, ended with a $293 million profit compared to a $138 million loss a year ago. With modest price increases year over year, Disney can probably keep streaming in the black if content costs are managed well. But inside of these numbers, there's a more nuanced story. To reach profitability, Disney has not just focused on subscription numbers and rates, it has also reduced costs, largely by limiting the number of live-action series that it greenlights, series produced by Marvel and Lucasfilm. The twin engines that drove much of Disney Plus's initial expansion in subscribers were limited series that leaned towards teens and adults set in either the Star Wars universe or the MCU, with theatrical-level budgets and a lot of special effects. Iger's initial vision for Disney Plus had a greater emphasis on family viewing with some family-friendly offerings from Lucasfilm and Marvel. Chapek, however, when he took over as CEO in 2020, a few months after Disney Plus premiered, wanted the streamer to compete more with Netflix, which shifted the emphasis areas inside of programming. In short, under Chapek, orders were made for expensive live-action limited series to increase adult viewership, as there was no way for Disney Plus to compete with Netflix if the center of programming was largely arranged for families with children under the age of 13. But this strategy significantly drove up content costs for the streamer, which included a staggering one-quarter loss of $1.5 billion in the final part of 2022. This, in turn, led to Chapek essentially being fired. Here's how this played out. In 2021, on Disney Plus, there were 4 Marvel live-action series plus What If. There was 1 Star Wars live-action series. In 2022, there were 3 Marvel live-action series plus 2 Star Wars live-action series. Note this is the quarter that included that $1.5 billion loss with Chapek as CEO. Following this, with Iger as CEO, orders for original live-action limited series with expensive and cast budgets began to decline. In 2023, there were 2 Marvel live-action series plus What If, plus 2 Star Wars live-action series. Some of these were holdovers from the Chapek era, but they aired after he left the company. In 2024, there were 2 Marvel live-action series plus What If, plus 2 Star Wars live-action series, but by 2024, the popularity and quality of these high-budget MCU and Lucasfilm shows were beginning to drop along with their budgets. Early Disney Plus series featured The Mandalorian, Andor, WandaVision, and Loki. These did remarkably well. More recent Disney Plus series, specifically those from 2024, featured The Acolyte, Skeleton Crew, Echo, and Agatha All Along, all of which had fewer special effects, fewer A-list stars, and never rose to the heights of popularity of those earlier offerings. In 2021 alone, WandaVision raked in 7.3 billion viewing minutes, while its sequel, Agatha All Along, in 2024, only received 2.2 billion minutes of viewing, even though Disney Plus had a larger subscription base at that time. To be fair, WandaVision premiered during the second year of the pandemic, but by then, many people, but certainly not all, were spending more time away from home. But a heightened popularity of TV during the late months of the pandemic alone can't account for a 70% dip in viewership between WandaVision and Agatha All Along. The more recent show simply isn't connecting as deeply with audiences as the earlier show. Or to put this another way, WandaVision has a 92% freshness on the tomato meter, while Agatha came in a little bit lower at 84%. Or to spin this one last way, WandaVision cost a reported $225 million in production costs, while Agatha cost just $40 million. And in saying that, again to be fair, I should point out that the one current outlier in all of this is the second season of Andor. That show, in continuing the story started 3 years ago back in 2022, will have a robust budget. It will also be focused on a more adult audience. It will take the Andor story up to its close, essentially up to the point of Rogue One. It was also greenlit a long time ago. But the strong trend here with Disney Plus is to reduce or better manage budgets and to shift more of the focus of the streamer onto family viewing. Iger's plan now seems to be to create a streamer focused more on vault titles and new family offerings, along with a few shows for a teen-friendly audience. Chapek's vision for Disney Plus was to create a Netflix-like streamer with content for all age groups with cinema-quality stories. This plan increased subscribers but produced staggering losses that directly led to his removal from the company. Iger's vision maybe produces a smaller subscription base but also produces a small profit. The question for Disney streaming right now is this: how much growth is there for a streamer that is closer to Iger's original vision? Lower cost original shows with a focus more centered on family viewing. It appears that Iger's vision is sustainable and can be profitable, but also in terms of Wall Street's interest here, Disney Plus no longer has the high growth potential that some thought it did back with Chapek, even though the Chapek vision proved to be financially disastrous for the company. So now that Disney Plus has settled into its own groove, the issue now is how interested are investors in this likely stable but less expansive model of the streamer. A cursory overview of what's coming to Disney Plus presents a very different image of the streamer than its offerings from 2021 and 2022, when it appeared that theatrical films and expensive series were showing up each month, often with an MCU limited series ending just as a Star Wars series was beginning. Among those series that will draw interest in 2025 are Andor Season 2, a reboot of the Daredevil series previously on Netflix, and a number of MCU projects that introduce new but relatively unknown characters such as Wonder Man and Ironheart. Beyond that, there's some animation from Pixar and Marvel. Add in some Percy Jackson and Goosebumps, and this is a far, far more family-centered streamer with significantly lower content costs than the streamer under Bob Chapek. And again, the question here is, will this be enough? The last section we want to look at today are experiences, which mostly means the resorts and the cruise line. The cruise line is a division of active expansion within the company. With 7 more ships on the way, there appears to be few financial concerns in this division. Vacations at sea are moving forward nicely. The parks, however, are an entirely different story. The parks overall are up, but inside these numbers is the question, which parks are up and why? The international parks, where there are new themed lands, new rides, and so on, saw a 28% growth this past quarter in income. Simply open up a Zootopia land or a World of Frozen, add in some lush decorations for the winter holidays, add in a lot of live entertainment, and it's amazing how that brings in people during Q1, which again is the last 3 months of the year. New attractions are simply the primary attendance drivers at Disney parks. Guests are happy, executives are happy, and investors are happy when new attractions open and bring in people. The domestic resorts, however, ended with a 5% drop in income. And up front, I'd like to suggest that this likely equated to a bit more than a 5% dip in attendance, as additional income was brought in by the way of relatively new services, such as various Lightning Lane options, where the price continues to go up. And lower levels of visitation match what I've seen, particularly in Florida, where some cash hotels on property have low occupancy rates, which reduces revenue in multiple areas. But also in all of this, there are a few places where Disney has been effectively able to increase revenue in the domestic resorts. I should point out that Disney officially pointed to a hurricane as partially lowering income for the quarter, and there is some truth to that, but I think there's a lot more going on here. Since the numbers in the report don't separate Disneyland from Disney World, let's start with that, because at least as far as I can see, the two coasts tell two very different stories. Overall, I'm fairly sure most of the lower attendance and reduced income is focused at the Florida resort. I'll get into the reasons why in just a moment. But the reset point here was definitely COVID. In terms of attendance, most of the American Disney parks never fully recovered from the pandemic, but the downward patterns were worse in Florida. I'm in all 6 American Disney parks most months and have been doing this for many years. In 2019, the Florida parks were a crush of people, sometimes to the point of being uncomfortable. From personal experience here, I can tell you that this level of visitation simply hasn't returned. Some of this actually improves the guest experience to a certain extent. Lower crowds usually means the parks are easier to navigate with shorter lines, but lower crowds also mean a pullback in other elements, such as park hours and live entertainment. Beyond the guest experience, the level of attendance is now lowering financial expectations for the experiences division, and that, at least for Disney, is a real problem. Here are the numbers, where I have them, that chart this decline. The last pre-COVID year, which was 2019, saw nearly 21 million people visit the Magic Kingdom in Florida. 2023, which is the most recent year for which I have numbers, saw 17.7 million people visit that park, which is nearly identical to the number of people that visited the Magic Kingdom in 2012. So the combination of COVID plus a lack of recent reinvestment in Florida erased a decade of visitation growth at the Magic Kingdom. The story is the same over at Epcot. 2023 numbers match 2012. The two outliers in Florida are Hollywood Studios and Animal Kingdom. Hollywood Studios in 2023 was up slightly over its 2013 numbers, which I put down to Galaxy's Edge and Toy Story Land. Again, investment in new lands and high-quality rides equals higher attendance, which lasts for years. And Animal Kingdom, the park with the least current investments, is substantially down. For Animal Kingdom, to find a year with the same level of attendance as 2023, you'd need to go all the way back to 2005. To put this simply, overall park attendance is down in Florida by millions. And beyond this, there doesn't seem to be a robust plan to improve visitation levels until 2027. The story in California is significantly different. Disneyland is still below its pre-COVID numbers, but far less so than the Magic Kingdom. In 2019, 18.6 million people visited Disneyland. In 2023, it was 17.3. It's down by a little over 1 million guests, whereas Magic Kingdom is down by over 3 million guests, which is substantial. Disneyland still feels very busy to me when I'm there, particularly in the evenings, that is, after people get off work, and on Saturdays. And Disney's California Adventure is actually up over pre-COVID numbers, 10 million visitors in 2023 compared to 9.8 million in 2019. Again, I would put some of this down to Adventure's Campus, also the growing focus on festivals for locals. Regardless, the California numbers overall are far better than the Florida numbers. And let me add in one more element. The visitation patterns on the two coasts are different as well. Disneyland is still a regional resort with most of its customers driving rather than flying to the parks. Disney World, however, is a resort destination in which guests tend to arrive by air. Disney World is far more affected by the price of air travel and, to a lesser extent, the cost of gas. So the next question to ask would be this: is Disney World attendance down due to larger trends in the travel market? That does not seem to be the case at all. Even a quick check of TSA passenger volume for the last week of Q1 2024 compared to the last week of Q1 2023 shows a noticeable rise in activity. For the final week of 2023, the TSA screened just over 17 million passengers. For the final week of 2024, they screened just over 18 million. So Disney World attendance remains lower even when overall U.S. travel is up. And this brings up the question, why? Earlier this month, the Wall Street Journal published an article called "Even Disney is Concerned About the High Cost of a Disney Vacation." It did quote some executives by name from the C-suite, but also relied on unnamed sources inside the company to frame their argument. Here is the center of the article's claim. Some inside Disney worry that the company has become addicted to price hikes and has reached the limits of what middle-class Americans can afford, according to people who have worked on park pricing. Internal discussions over whether Disney parks may be losing their grips on the hearts and wallets of families with young children have become more frequent, some of those people said. And this, if true, is a problem for a company largely focused on middle-class tastes that manages mass entertainment, including a resort that requires tens of millions of visitors each year to remain profitable. In the article, sources point to pricing as one of the two main barriers as to why Disney World hasn't recovered to pre-pandemic levels of visitation. The other being a lack of new investments in rides and attractions. From personal observations, I would say that in this group of Disney cost-conscious customers, there are definitely two different camps. For once-in-a-lifetime visitors or once-in-a-decade visitors, the sticker shock of ticket prices plus on-property hotel rates is the largest economic hurdle. For those who visit regularly and are used to regular increases on ticket prices, I think it is more likely to shift from once-included services to paid options, Fast Pass to paid Lightning Lanes, Magical Express to paid Mears Connect, and the removal of old, once-included perks, such as evening extra magic hours for everyone on property. Almost anyone deeply involved in a fan group is aware of ways to reduce or manage costs related to their interests. Simply, there are options that the general public tends not to know about. Regular guests to Disney World have likely learned ways to reduce the cost of hotels and food if they would like to reduce those costs. For example, you can rent DVC points, stay off property, use Marriott points at the Swan and Dolphin, arrange your trips around various promotions, use Uber Eats to have meals delivered, use Instacart to have groceries delivered, and pack a bottle or two of red wine into your luggage. But there are other costs that are difficult to avoid, such as Mears Connect instead of Magical Express, and foregoing some items with a cost reduce the quality of the experience, such as foregoing Lightning Lane, particularly during peak visitation periods. These latter examples are more of the areas that are more of a concern for frequent visitors. One of the questions that I have here, to which I do not have numbers, is how much of these new services, such as Lightning Lane, reduce spending elsewhere for a typical middle-class family? That is, do these families pay for Lightning Lane by foregoing some table service meals, or buying fewer souvenirs, or staying off property, or having a slightly shorter stay? To put this directly, did Lightning Lane significantly increase per-person spending, or did it mean that guests cut spending elsewhere to fit Lightning Lane inside of their vacation budget? Again, I don't know, but I suspect it's a little of each, and I'm guessing that any further upcharges for tickets, Lightning Lanes, and so on place corresponding pressure for middle-class guests to spend less elsewhere, or even decide that the overall price tag for the vacation is no longer worth it. Anecdotally, mostly from talking to cast members who work in these roles, it seems that the number of people visiting Disney World restaurants, and particularly the bars, has been down over the last 2 years. There are clearly some exceptions. Ohana is always packed. Teppan Edo does a nice business, but restaurants a little further down the list in terms of popularity seem to be less full now than they were a couple years ago, particularly the upper-end options such as Topolino's, Tiffin's, and Gico. This may be due to menu pricing or the overall cost of the vacation, or again, it simply may be a preference shift in how easy it is to have off-site meals delivered now to your hotel via Uber Eats or Grubhub. Regardless, if there's pressure on Disney to increase revenue from the domestic parks, which means mostly Florida, another round of upcharges will probably make the situation worse, as this is one of the elements that is limiting how often regulars choose to visit the resort. And generally, a regular customer is one you don't want to lose. Over time, regular customers will spend far more than once-in-a-lifetime visitors. So the next area to consider in terms of price adjustments on property are hotels. That is, can Disney increase rates at its hotels to increase profit, even if it loses a little in terms of occupancy? Again, this is a mixed answer. For middle-class and value visitors, increased hotel rates here are pretty much a non-starter. and Disney knows this, but there seems to be some place to expand at the upper end in terms of hotel resorts. Let's look at the numbers this way. In 2019, the cost range for a standard room at Pop Century, which is a value resort, was between $131 and $246 per night. That is, if you weed out a few key holiday periods. In 2024, using those same factors and dates, it was generally between $180 and $250 per night. That is, there's not a lot of change, especially in the upper end numbers, and some of the lower numbers now are actually even better because Disney has used free dining to increase value there. Or to put this simply, Disney appears unable to increase the upper tier of hotel rates for value customers and still keep those value hotels reasonably full. And by reasonably, I mean above 80% occupancy. I've been told by people who work with the resorts that the numbers for some on-property hotels in the last 2 years has dipped substantially below 80%. In contrast, during these same years, Disney has been able to increase pricing at the deluxe hotels, using the same categories and date ranges, that is, standard rooms and removing holidays with outlier rates. A room at the Contemporary in 2019 sold for between $413 and $535 per night. And in 2024, the rate range jumped to $572 to $762. So the upper end range for non-holiday bookings for Pop Century rose over 5 years by just 2%. During the same time, for the same category, rooms at the Contemporary rose by 45%. I should point out that these numbers are not adjusted for inflation. Once you adjust for inflation, though, Disney is actually selling rooms at Pop Century for less than they did pre-pandemic, and the same is true for the All-Stars, while rates at the Contemporary, which is a deluxe hotel with inflation factored in, is up in real dollars around 20%. To break this down, these charges suggest that Disney is more pointedly aware that their value customers cannot be squeezed any more on price before they simply go somewhere else for their vacation. While the price patterns suggest that there may be some room for price growth at the upper end. And this here is where the calculations become tricky for Disney. First off, there are over 10,000 rooms in the value category on property. The underlying patterns suggest that these rooms are maximized for price presently. Not filling them means fewer meals, fewer tickets, and less merch sold across property. It also means that Disney may lose an opportunity to attract younger families who might then enjoy more Disney vacations as their family and family income grows and changes over time. So if they are priced out, Disney then loses an entry point that may lead to other vacations. But Disney is also under pressure to increase profits from the American parks, which surely means Florida. Price increases at this point beyond those accounted for by inflation are likely to only be absorbed by visitors at the upper end of the economic strata, which is generally what Disney has been doing, increasing VIP tours, creating higher-tier Lightning Lane packages, and focusing on DVC sales. Even there, the last item, DVC sales, hasn't been going so well over the last couple years. The recently opened DVC cabins at Fort Wilderness are not selling particularly well, and as far as I can tell, the new Poly Tower, sales there have been a little sluggish, but nowhere near as bad as the cabins. The big problem here is this. For 2 years, Chapek used profit from the parks to backfill losses on the streamer. Remember that $1.5 billion single-quarter loss on Disney streaming? Well, essentially, a good deal of money to cover that came from the parks, which meant that there was limited investment in new attractions and new lands. In fact, some announced projects were even canceled, but also it would be unfair to blame all of that on Chapek. There was also the pandemic, which reduced revenue for years at the resorts and led to cutbacks. But this all led to the current moment. Though Disney can have new entertainment offerings at its parks, and it can retheme existing attractions in 2025 and 2026, neither California nor Florida will have any entirely new e-ticket attractions or themed lands until 2027, assuming construction goes well. For decades, investors have seen the American parks as reliable money machines for Disney, always producing a meaningful profit except for periods far outside of Disney's control, such as for COVID or the months following 9/11. In the 1970s and early 1980s, Disney as a company largely managed to stay afloat due to the parks. The parks made money, while the studio put out a number of low-earning films such as The Shaggy DA, Herbie Goes to Monte Carlo, Superdad, and The Boatniks. This now is the first time in many years where investors see financial problems at the resorts during a period of a stable economy. And by resorts again, I mostly mean Florida. And this, I think, is the biggest drag on the stock price. The main culprit, no new lands or attractions, also coupled with narratives of squeezing people who go there for upcharged experiences and add-ons. Investors also know that there will now be 3 years without any large additions to the American parks, while during that same time, Universal will open a large park in Orlando in 2025 and a high-speed outdoor coaster themed to the Fast and the Furious in California in 2026. At this point, Disney's main weapons to increase visitation will be with entertainment offerings, hotel discounts, free dining, and other discounts, while at the same time trying to increase per capita spending on the deluxe guests. If I had to take a guess, to keep those rooms full, the cost of a Disney vacation for value guests is almost surely going down slightly in 2025 and 2026, so that Disney can fill rooms and also fill its parks, while the cost for deluxe visitors is likely going up. Exactly how this works, I'm not 100% sure, but expect pricing at deluxe hotels to creep a little higher. Look for other VIP-level add-on options. Look for adjustments to lightning lanes, not the basic service, but other higher-end options. Exactly how this will be arranged, I'm not sure, but I have some guesses. So maybe multi-day or length of stay Lightning Lane Premier options, or multi-park Lightning Lane Premier at a higher cost, or a Premier option that allows you to re-ride any attraction you want, or some other options that bundle Lightning Lane into existing Disney dining packages. The pricing plan, as it's starting to evolve, at least until Tropical Americas opens, will almost surely have more discounting targeted at value visitors while creating new upscale elements to purchase for deluxe visitors. But generally it's going to be a difficult 3 years for the Florida resort until the resort can open new lands that will drive visitation. And that's the real solution here. It's far easier to bring people to the resort to see exciting new attractions than it is to convince them to visit one more time because they enjoyed their previous visit there. And that reminds me, here in the middle of February, there is still no approved plan to move forward with the Rivers of America closure, or maybe a partial closure, which is the first step toward the creation of 2 of Disney World's biggest projects, the Cars area in Frontierland and then Villains Land. Nothing in these projects can move forward in earnest until the South Florida Water Management District signs off on a Disney plan. That this didn't happen at the end of January, that is 30 days after Disney submitted their revisions, suggests there are still ongoing problems here. And the back and forth from what I've been able to observe in publicly available documents has gotten a little testy in recent months, which probably isn't helping the situation. So, without state buy-in on the Magic Kingdom plans, Disney is going to focus on tropical Americas at Animal Kingdom, and then will likely move up Monsters Incorporated land at Hollywood Studios, as neither of these projects will face much regulatory issues. So here, I would expect Disney to tightly oversee construction on Tropical Americas to make sure that it hits its 2027 date, as that is essential. Demo work has already started to take down structures in the old Dino Land, and though this wasn't the initial plan, Monsters Land in 2028, with the Cars area now likely bumped back to 2029, or maybe really even a bit further. So, in closing up for today's episode, let me say this. In multiple divisions at Disney, there are 3 fairly nervous years for the company moving forward, as streaming hopefully finds small but reliable profits, as theatrical tests a large slate of films to see how much ticket sale growth there might be in a post-pandemic theatrical ecosystem, and as the resorts look for ways to overcome the mess left them by Chapek, a lack of ongoing investments that will be particularly noticeable this year and next. And that generally is where we are in the early part of 2025. There is a lot to watch in all of this, and we will see month by month how it all plays out as these projects move forward. Today, we covered a lot. We looked at Disney's theatrical release schedule for 2025 and talked about the underlying experiment there, in which the company was testing how much audience expansion there might be here in a post-COVID audience. We explored the pros and cons of Iger's plan for the Disney streamer by focusing more on family-friendly offerings and limiting high-budget, effects-heavy miniseries. And we discussed how the American Disney parks have never recovered to pre-COVID numbers, and we also looked at what is clearly Disney's strategy to increase revenue in Florida with deluxe guests while limiting price increases to value guests as a way of maintaining visitation numbers at that resort. And in these areas, we can see what's working, also where the Disney company is trying to change strategies, and why the stock price is stuck in a narrow price channel, as for the past year or two, there's been no growth in key areas. And with this, we are finished with our State of the Company overview. As always, I'll be back next week with a new episode, one in which we'll move back into the history of the Disney company. Lastly, as you know, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. We do just 2 things: deep dives on stories related to the history of the Disney studio and the parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Disney company. We are funded entirely by listener contributions, specifically by listeners who join us over on Bandcamp as monthly subscribers. On Bandcamp, you will find over 300 episodes not available on iTunes or anywhere else. But the best reason to join us there is to support the work we do here and to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can support us by becoming a monthly subscriber at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in our show notes. So, until next Sunday, this is Todd James Pierce.